So, good afternoon, friends, colleagues. It's a great pleasure to welcome each one of you for this panel discussion today that we have, focusing largely in terms of infrastructure financing, the investments that are needed, and how we see the sustainable growth component of it, in what way we can take that forward, with issues related to financing of infrastructure, issues that are related to quality infrastructure. How do we define and differentiate the nature of financing, and also the nature of infrastructure which is coming up? And from that perspective, Japan has been one of the leaders in terms of looking into the sustainable financing models, and also the resilient infrastructure that we need. During Japan's G20 presidency, issues came up in a major way in terms of how we define this quality infrastructure, in what way issues related to sustainable financing comes in. The idea that the green bonds would come up have enhanced the challenges for the developing countries, particularly in terms of the fragmentation of finance and going up of the cost of accessing capital, which is much higher for least developed countries than for developed countries themselves. So the challenges are immense, and concerns for sustainability within finance have taken roots which have actually enhanced challenges for the global south. And from that point of view, India's G20 presidency has placed forward the idea of digital public infrastructure. We are trying to take that forward as sort of manifestation in terms of how citizen-centric services may be prioritized in infrastructure financing, and how we can bring in quality change in lives of people than focusing on quality infrastructure alone. And from that perspective, India's own development model is emerging as a unique development model in terms of how we look at some of these dimensions of engagement, what kind of spillover effects we see, and how we look at the financing component, the deficit that we are looking into. And from that point of view, Yoshino-san, we have been talking about the ideas that are there in terms of local resource mobilization. I'm extremely delighted that the Vice Chairman Niti has joined us today. He was very closely linked with the exercise of budget formulation. This year, India's budgetary allocation for infrastructure, capital expenditure for that matter, is somewhere close to $133 billion. And that has given a huge impetus in terms of our continued support for CapEx for last 7 years. And this is largely in terms of our own effort for local resource mobilization. So on one hand, India is talking about localization of development, but on the other, through our own experience, we are demonstrating how local resource mobilization is also possible. With entities like AIIB and the New Development Bank, how much we think they are different from the way World Bank and others have evolved, to what extent cost of accessing finance has been made much more cost effective than just the quantums that are available to Global South. We have been critical of the Bretton Woods, but the new institutions from Global South haven't helped much in terms of reducing this. And that's where the larger challenge lies. The sustainability concerns juxtaposing on the infrastructure finance have further complicated challenges. And we have great panel today, somebody who wrote India's infrastructure roadmap, Professor Rakesh Mohan, who is here. So thanks for joining in. And Dr. Suman Berry, who's leading India's most prominent think tank and the government machinery. So thanks, Dr. Suman Berry, for joining us today. Without further ado, let me request you, Dr. Berry, for your initial remarks, and inviting Dr. Yoshino-san for today's lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chaturvedi. Initially, my apologies for keeping everybody waiting. Some of you may have read in the papers that we had our flagship event, Niti Ayog's Governing Council meeting, which took up most of my bandwidth over the week leading up to Saturday, and there was just a lot of spillover after that. And I'm particularly apologetic because the one thing I've learned in 50 years of association with Japan and Japanese is that it is unforgivable to be late. So my apologies to you, Dr. Yoshino. But I'm here most of all out of respect to Dr. Yoshino and the partnership between India and Japan, and also because of his earlier association with the ADBI, with which I had professional associations. Also because I think through the course of the Japanese G20 presidency, the Japanese G7 presidency, India's G20 presidency, and indeed discussions that have taken place, 2 or 3 things are clear. One is that Japan sees, as it were, the energy transition in somewhat different ways from, let's say, the Anglo-Saxon countries, and perhaps we'll get into that. Secondly, that the Japanese know a thing or two about resilient infrastructure, and I think the issue of sustainability is not only one of energy, but it's also about resilience. And of course, India has contributed to the CDRI, which has been focused on disaster resilient infrastructure. But I'm getting between you and Dr. Yoshino. But let me just say that an additional pleasure of being at the podium is because of the presence of my long-standing friend and colleague, Dr. Rakesh Mohan, who bequeathed to me, when I took over from him at NCAR, a rich program, as Dr. Chaturvedi has mentioned, of work on infrastructure, including a draft of the energy bill, as it was, which became the Energy Act 2003, and was really one of the pioneers, both in thinking about urban infrastructure, but also thinking about the financing of infrastructure of all kinds, leading in part to the creation of the IDFC. And then finally, Professor Chaturvedi, who, as in his role with the T20 during India's G20, convened very important discussions. So I would just make one additional point, because Dr. Chaturvedi did mention the budget, which is that the budget spoke of the finalization, if I could call it that, of a taxonomy to facilitate funding of green infrastructure. But I think what we're finding, and what I think NITI will try and apply its mind to, is that many of the public finance challenges are to do with the adaptation agenda. So I would just hope that as we get into the discussion with Dr. Yoshino, and maybe learn from him of how Japan deals with issues of post-disaster recovery, which are closely linked to adaptation, what lessons we can learn from them. So with thanks to Dr. Chaturvedi for this invitation, please may I request Dr. Yoshino to deliver his remarks.
Prior to India was Italy, and I was also visited many countries. I studied in Johns Hopkins University, where my classmate was Pranav Sen, Statistical Commission. He was my classmate. He and I were supervised by Sir Alan Walters, who was Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's supervisor. So we studied together for so many years. Today, I would like to talk about infrastructure investment including at the last part, I'd like to talk about green infrastructure and green public infrastructures. I hope it runs well. Can you? Okay, thank you. So I would like to make 5 points today. First one is long-term impact of infrastructure is very important. And second one is PPP, public-private partnerships, failed in many countries, especially in Latin America and Asia. So I'm going to talk about why it failed, what would be needed. I was invited by Latin American ministers of finance last May, so I gave the same presentation about PPP in Latin America. So today I'm going to talk about number 3. Spillover effects of infrastructure investments are very important. And I compared Japanese case and Indian case. Spillover impacts of infrastructure in India is lower than Japan. So that should be much more improved. And number 4 is land trust is one of the ways to smoothen the land acquisition by infrastructure investors. And last one, I would like to talk about environmental issues, which I am now working on. This diagram shows the spillover effects are very important in infrastructure. In G20 Japan, it was called a quality infrastructure. Quality means physical quality is important. At the same time, spillover effects of infrastructures are very important to measure quality. So this shows digital infrastructure or transport infrastructure that can bring new businesses into the region. New services sector, restaurants, and manufacturing industries will start their operation. If train lands close to them, then they can build apartments and shopping malls, and new industry can be created. Even agricultural farmers can sell their products to large cities. So those are the spillover effects of infrastructure investment. 20, 30 years ago in Japan, infrastructure investors and construction companies are only interested in constructing infrastructure without taking the consideration into spillover impacts. So this is very important how to incentivize those infrastructure operators to increase spillover impacts. So this is port infrastructure. It also applies port, railways, digital infrastructure, or the infrastructure investment. Important thing is how to bring private businesses into the region, how to increase employment, and how to increase the quality of life. Those are the importance of infrastructure investment. Economists often use production function. Y is the output, F is the function, KP is private capital, and L is employment. In textbooks, we often use K and L without focusing on infrastructure of KG. Infrastructure KG will bring not only their construction has impact onto regional GDP, but also green line that can bring private businesses into the region. That can contribute additional increase of output in the region. That will create new employment, yellow line, labor, and that can contribute consumption into the region, and so on. So these green line and yellow line are the directions of spillover effects. And if the spillover effects are very large, you can see in the bottom, that will increase property tax revenues, corporate tax revenues, income tax revenues, and sales tax revenues. In the past, many people are talking about land capture by infrastructure investment. And that is only focusing on property tax revenues. but infrastructure can bring much further increase of various tax revenues, corporate tax, income tax, and sales tax. In the past, all those tax revenues went to the government, and infrastructure operators only received user charges. So that's why revenue from infrastructure investments were very low. Those spillover impacts had been forgotten. All the benefits just collected as a tax by the government, they were not returned to infrastructure operators, construction companies, and so on. And in order to look at spillover effects, many people learn Cobb-Douglas production function. That cannot capture spillover effects. We have to use translog production function. This is a general form. Together with the share function, and we often use seemingly unrelated regressions, and that is a method we compute the spillover effects. So textbook type Cobb-Douglas production function cannot compute spillover effects because private capital, labor are independent each other. So this number shows the spillover effects of Japan from 1956 to 2010. First row is the direct effect. How much infrastructure itself has contributed to the production in there. Second line and third lines are spillover effects. As I said, infrastructure can bring new businesses into the region, which can increase private capital KB. And then new restaurants and so on can increase employment into the region. That is a third row, L. So second row and third rows are the spillover effects, and first row is a direct effect. Then if we add together, in case of Japan, about 68% of the impacts come from spillover effects, and only about 32%, one-third, is coming from just direct effect. In case of India, direct effects are about 80-90%, and spillover effects are only 10 or 11%, and that is very small. So India needs how to seek to develop the region and then increase spillover impacts, and in return, spillover tax revenues. That is lacking in India. I am staying at Hotel Lalit there, and I saw the station very close from my hotel room. There is no development in the station area. In Japan, at the station, dentist is there, and barber shops are there, and lots of restaurants and coffee shops, and that is one of the spillover effects. People who are commuting, they come back around 6, 7 o'clock. They don't have to go to dentist during daytime. Then they go to dentist and barber shops when they go home. So that is a way how to create spillover effects. And unfortunately, in India's case, those spillover effects are very small if we look at the stations in many places in here. Then next, I'd like to talk about the public-private partnerships, PPP. Japan also had experienced lots of failure of PPP. That can be shown in this diagram. In the middle is the infrastructure company, infrastructure operators. Left-hand side is users, and right-hand side is private investors. PPP, public-private partnerships, is to bring private investors into the construction of infrastructure. That comes from right-hand side. So private investors on the right-hand side prefers higher rate of return. On the other hand, left-hand side users, they prefer low prices, low fees. So there's a conflict between users and private investors. Private investors prefer higher rate of return. Users prefer low price. That's why PPP didn't work. Then we have to bring some other sources of revenue in order to satisfy both of them. Users keep the price very low, and private investors can receive higher rate of return. Then we have to bring some other money from outside. So I looked at spillover tax revenues. infrastructure can create huge spillover impacts into the region. That is not only manufacturing industries, services sector, but in case of Japan, agricultural farmers, fishermen are benefited by train. Those trains can bring fresh vegetables and fish to large city, Tokyo, within several hours. So that has created a huge positive impact to farmers and fishermen, and also manufacturers and services sector. So this diagram shows the failed cases of PPP. Most of the failure, gray part is Latin America, and blue part is from Asia. So many of the PPPs in Asia, including in Japan, failed because of this reason. So I'm now looking at the spillover effects created by infrastructure investment. So if you look at on the left-hand side, traditionally user fees were the main sources of revenues. Now you can look at the bottom, spillover tax revenues, not only land tax, but also corporate income tax, individual income tax, sales tax, and so on. All those tax revenues, part of them should be returned to infrastructure operators, construction companies, and so on. This will make the infrastructure much more sustainable. Japan has lots of infrastructure investment in Africa. Those infrastructures, railways and highways, run very well in the first several years. But after several years, they need repairs. However, they don't have money. Then all those very high quality infrastructure decays, and they are not doing very well. If these spillover tax revenues are continuously returned to infrastructure operators and construction companies, then they can receive huge amount of benefit from the government every year. That is the big sources for maintenance and repairs. Then how much percent of the money should be returned? So this estimation, direct effect and indirect effect. Among spillover total increased tax revenues, 68% should be returned to infrastructure operators and construction companies because those are the spillover effects. And direct effects are only 32%. So I hope in India's case, I can compute those numbers. Then that will tell how much percent should be returned to infrastructure operators and so on. Traditionally, the rate of return for infrastructure was black line. And horizontal line is the market rate of interest, government interest rate of bonds. So most of the cases, this is the case of Japan, black lines are shown, it is lower than interest rate on government bonds because they are only relying on user charges. But once we bring part of spillover tax revenues, then this black line goes up to the red line. And if the spillover effects are very large, then red line will keep on rising. That will increase much further and then higher than the interest rate on bonds. Then this is a success story. Many private investors, if they put their money, their rate of return is higher than the interest rate on government bonds. How could we compute those spillover tax revenues? There are two lines here. Blue line is the control group where there's no infrastructure. Then this is changes in tax revenues. Red line is a region where infrastructure has constructed. Then this curve becomes steeper because tax revenue is rising every year. Then we can compute delta T incremental tax revenues compared to other regions where there were no infrastructure investment. This is how we can compute the incremental tax revenue. Then we can estimate translog production function and divide this increment into direct effects and spillover effects. And once infrastructure operators and infrastructure construction companies receive these tax revenues, there are strong incentives for them to develop their station area and the region. If they develop the region, then their revenue will become higher and higher. And this has an incentive for them. Then what are the cases that success story of the incremental tax revenues? This is a case of expressway in Manila. If you can see for first column, then before the construction. Then at the blue point, then the operation has started. After fourth year, T+4 on the last column, please compare to the first column, then you can see the changes in tax revenues. Tax revenue has increased almost 3 times as much as before. So spillover effects of this expressway in Manila, you can see the huge impact onto the region. This is the Uzbekistan's railway. Agricultural sector has gained because farmers can sell their vegetables and rice to big cities because train has started to run. And services, industrial sector and services sector, all of them have significant impact by these railway lines. Furthermore, connectivities are important. When this rail line has connected to overseas, and also this rail line has been multiplied, then their impact became bigger than before. So connectivity is important, and also all the sectors will be benefited by new line. And this is a high-speed rail express train in case of Japan. So we can divide the various tax revenues. Left-hand side, 3 bars, a total increase of tax revenues. Then second from the left is corporate tax revenues. And then second from the left is income tax. And third one is corporate tax. Last one is property tax revenues. There are 3 bar chart. Blue one is before the construction. Yellow one is the completion of this express railway without connectivity to Tokyo and big cities. And gray one is after the connectivity has been completed. Then you can see left-hand side, total tax revenue has increased significantly. Corporate tax, income tax increased. But last one, other tax revenue, this includes property tax revenues, land tax. There were speculations even before the construction period. That's why the price of the land has started to rise before this high express railway has been completed. But corporate tax, income tax gained very much. So this express rail line was constructed in southern island of Kyushu. And I talked with the president of this Kyushu express line. So he started to develop the station area. The railway line started to construct apartments, buildings, and then they have gained huge amount of money coming from this railway line. So there was a strong incentive for this railway train company to increase spillover effects, and they captured by themselves. This is a case of Global System for Mobile Communications, GSM, of India's case. You can see the red line shows the incremental tax revenues compared to other regions. So even in India case, the increase of those spillover benefits are great in case of broadband global networks. And then when I computed this figure as a percent of the increase of rate of return, then you can see in the bottom, the rate of return had increased if these increased tax revenues were returned to operators of digital infrastructure, then the rate of return would have been increased 14.2% if entire tax revenues were returned to investors. So policy recommendations, user fees are not enough. And if infrastructure only relies on user fees, then that will create lots of failures. That is the case of Japan. And spillover tax revenue has to be returned. And then there is the incentives for the infrastructure companies. In case of Japan, railway companies worked very hard to develop the station area. And then employment has been increased. Lots of business has been created. And then the number 3, private finance will automatically comes from, because rate of return is much, much higher compared to relying on only user fees. Then floating infrastructure bond is one of the ways to introduce this kind of scheme. Spillover effects will be realized maybe 3, 4, 5 years after the construction of infrastructure investment. But financing has to come from the beginning. In the beginning, there's no spillover effects. But infrastructure company, if they receive private money, has to pay rate of interest. So this red line is the interest rate on government bonds. So my planned policy is government should pay the interest rate on government bonds for those private investors until these spillover effects be realized. Then in the red line shows a blue shaded line is the total spillover effects. So in this case, I'm talking about 50% of those spillover tax revenues should be returned to infrastructure operators. As I explained, accurately speaking, this percentage, how much should be returned, how much should be retained by the government, depends on direct effects and indirect effects, spillover effects. And when I talked to the minister, Dominguez of the Philippines, he said, Professor Yoshino's idea is theoretically good, but very much complicated. So he proposed, let's make 50-50. The total increase of tax revenue, 50% should go to government, 50% should be returned to infrastructure investors. Then he said, nobody will complain. So this is his idea. So I wrote one paper about return for 50% rather than sophisticated computation of translog production function. So in this case, 50% of the tax revenue can be returned. Then also he asked, if the return becomes so high, then the infrastructure companies could receive 30-40% of rate of return. And he said that is too much. So he proposed we should have some cap, that is horizontal line, maybe 15%, maybe the highest rate of return. This should be decided at the beginning. So from the beginning, then interest rate on government bonds will be paid. Then when the spillover tax revenue becomes realized, then they should pay 50% of those increased tax revenues, and then set some percent as a cap. And in this way, the government will keep the very much benefits, and there is a strong incentives for infrastructure investors to develop the region. And that, I think, is needed in case of India. Then next, I would like to talk about land acquisition, which is a very headache about 20-30 years ago in case of Japan. In Tokyo, there are 2 airports. One airport was old one, Haneda Airport. And new airport was called Narita Airport. And then government wants to have very high-speed railway between Tokyo and Narita Airport. It is about 75 kilometers. Then bullet train was planned. But surprisingly, 2 landowners opposed to sell their land. And unfortunately, this plan was abolished. By learning those failures, we started the land trust about 30 years ago. This is applied to commercial building and commercial housing and buildings. In Tokyo, land is very scarce. And sometimes landowners say, this land is coming from my ancestors. I don't want to sell. So land trust is ownership is their own land. Owners are their own land. And they are leasing the land to those apartments and buildings. In case of Hong Kong, they are using very similar method. And leasing period is 99 years or 999 years. And those are the land trust leasing period. Then owners can own the land and receive the rent every year from the performance of the buildings and railways. So in this way, land acquisition became very easy. So we don't have to turn down the road and so on. And that will make the construction much, much easier in many parts of the Japan. High-rise building, apartment, commercial buildings. So I hope a similar method can be applied in case of India. Thailand is going to introduce this land trust. Lastly, I would like to talk about the environmental issues associated with infrastructure. So please look at the left-hand side. Production is usually Y is the only output. But now CO2 and other wastes are another negative outputs by production. So left-hand side is good output Y, and then CO2 emissions as a model. So this paper is published in Energies, and if you are interested in, I can send the paper. Then input is on the right-hand side, labor and capital. Then how do we cope with these CO2 emissions? And this is the handbook of green finance. Professor Jeffrey Sachs liked my idea, so he agreed to have a joint book. And if you're interested in book is very expensive, so I cannot send my book, but I can send my papers to you by secretly, just private way. Then how to cope with this CO2? There are many tools now proposed. I didn't write it here. One is carbon tax. Another one is green bond. Another one is SDGs bond. And green banking and so on. So there are many proposals about how to cope with these CO2 emissions. And theoretically, the best way is carbon tax. And measuring the amount of carbons and charge tax. And that should be deducted from their profits. That can reduce the emission of CO2 by each company. And tax rate can be adjusted based on the goal. If 2030 is net zero or 2050 is net zero, and looking at the progress of the reduction of CO2, they can change the tax rate. And that is one of the ways to reduce CO2, theoretically speaking. Another one is carbon pricing. Carbon pricing is based on carbon trading among various companies. So government set up some cap ceiling for companies to expose their CO2. And some of the companies are below these CO2 emission cap. Then they can sell their room. And other companies whose exposure of CO2 is higher than these cap, then they have to purchase those amount of CO2. That is a carbon trading. Then price will be determined. So carbon pricing is connected with carbon trading among various companies who is exceeding the amount of CO2 emission up to the cap. And another one is below those CO2 emissions. They trade each other. Then the price of carbon is very different from region by region and country by country. Highest price is coming from Europe, Germany, and lowest price is coming from China. The lowest price because they set up the cap very high. Then the emission is very easy to do. European case is very low. So we need some coordination where we should set up the cap. Otherwise, the carbon pricing and carbon trading will not work well. So the problem with current carbon pricing is each country has a different cap, that makes the carbon prices so different from one country to another. So we have to make them into coordinated manner. And then that will become very close to that carbon tax. Last one is a carbon green bond. Third one is a green bond. International Capital Market Associations, ICMA, defined what kind of projects can issue green bond. They have listed 10 criteria. Number one is green energy project, solar power, wind power. Second one is energy efficient building and energy efficient projects, and so on. So there are 10 criteria. You can look up International Capital Market Associations based in Paris. However, I asked the energy efficient building in Tokyo, and how much percent CO2 has been reduced in one building. Then construction company said, Professor Yoshino, I don't know exactly how much, but I'm sure that must be about 20-30% smaller than other traditional building. And I went to another building. Then they said, we don't know, about 20%. So criteria is very good. However, it is not so accurate. And again, we have to measure the amount of CO2 emissions in each building. And in Japan, the new equipment has been invented, just like a thermometer. Thermometer together with the measurement of CO2 emissions. And in Yokohama City, primary school, secondary school, high school, all of them have those CO2 measurement in their classroom. Then students can realize how much CO2 they are exposing every day. And so in this equipment, it costs about $30-40 US. There are so many small tools has been created in Japan. And then if small businesses, large businesses set up that small kit tool, then the temperature and also the amount of CO2 emission can be measured very easily.
I'm sorry, we started late, but I believe we have a hard stop. Okay, so the last few, yeah.
Maybe then I would like to conclude. So in this way, I think we can cope with the negative externalities, but we need an accurate definition of the measurement is very important. And then green bond and carbon tax and ESG investment, all of them will become equivalent. So that's all my presentation. Thank you very much.
I know that I will pay if I have to cut my good friend Rakesh Mohan off. So let me pass the word to him immediately. Rakesh, roughly how long? 20 minutes? Or?
Yeah, less than 20. Thank you very much, Professor Chaturvedi, for inviting me to this really very, very interesting lecture. Particularly, as you yourself had mentioned, in view of my long-standing interest and work in infrastructure. But this also is, I think, the very first time that I'm speaking at an event in RIS. So this is really, thank you so much for inviting me. Let me start on a lighter note. My first visit to Japan was 43 years ago, in 1980, with Suman Berry. So we had visited both Tokyo and Kyoto, and of course, highlight was going on the Shinkansen. And maybe that's what started my interest both in East Asia and also in infrastructure. So I feel very privileged to have this opportunity commenting on this very interesting and innovative presentation by Professor Naoyuki Yoshino. It's very seldom actually that you can get such a lucid presentation and relatively brief on a whole body of work that he has done, and of course he's given the references. And it's also, I would say, that he must be among the very few scholars who've done such detailed work on private sector financing, the issues that arise of infrastructure, and particularly in public-private partnerships. So thank you very much, Professor Ishiro, because it was so clear. Quite frankly, I was amazed how clear it was, because it's quite easy to confuse people on infrastructure and measurements of their benefits and financing, etc. And of course, you know that this is very important for India, since we are among the countries which have the largest, I think, the largest PPP program in the world, probably. But you will probably know that better. But of course, which have had a number of problems over the last couple of decades. But that is not surprising because, again, as you mentioned, Latin America has had very, very large problems which have been documented and discussed. So this is a very welcome lecture. Now, let me just give some background in the sense that since I see mostly young people here about half my age, so it'd be useful to recollect that the movement for private sector participation in infrastructure began worldwide really only in the early 1990s. Prior to that, there were some exceptions. So I know that in Japan, although the Japanese National Railway was government owned, but many of the local railways were private railways. So they had longer experience actually. And this has been done through different methods. Also, another exception notable was the railroad network in the United States, right from the beginning till now, except that actually they've done the opposite way, that the passenger railways are now, some of them, owned by the government. But otherwise, railways, certainly the freight railways, which are the largest part of US railways, are private sector. And surprisingly, US actually, in terms of freight movement, the largest proportion is moved by railways and not by road, despite the huge expressway network. It's larger than Europe, by the way, in terms of freight movement as a proportion of total freight movement. So that's another exception, that is almost all private sector in the United States. And of course, earlier, there was the AT&T telecom monopoly until when? In 1980s, if I remember correctly, I think, that they were broken up. And of course, as I said, some railway lines in Japan. But now what is interesting is the much of investment in the railways in both Latin America and India and maybe some other countries, which was done in the 19th century, much of it, but was done through government. Most of it was done through government guaranteed bonds, including almost all the private sector investment railways in India in the 19th century. But in most of those cases, certainly in India, and I think much of Latin America also, those government guaranteed bonds failed. That is to say, the government actually then had to pay up the bond repayments because the companies couldn't pay. And then that finally, over took some time, led essentially to nationalization of the railways in India. Also, what is interesting in the US, much of the private investment in railways was financed through the award of land grants to railway companies. So basically, the government gave them free land. Of course, in the US, across the country from east to west, north to south, there was abundant land. So it didn't cost very much, in some sense, to the government awarded. And basically, the railway companies made a lot of money through those, by monetizing those land grants. But there was rampant corruption involved in that. And as an aside, Stanford University derives its name from Leland Stanford, who was then governor of California. But he had been a railroad magnate who had made most of his money through corruption, through the land grants. So that's sort of just, by the way, on the origins of Stanford University. But the point is that both of these methods of providing government support, either through government guaranteed bonds or through these land grants, are different ways of doing public-private partnerships. That's yet another form of public-private partnership. Whatever the details and what happened, at least the infrastructure got built and it survives to this day. This just by way of background, in the sense that there's been kind of a cycle that because governments were very small till early 20th century, in fact, till the Second World War, actually, that a lot of investment was done in the private sector in different ways in different countries. But the basic conceptual point about infrastructure financing is exactly what Professor Ishino has been talking about, that infrastructure investors are not able to capture the full returns of their investments because of positive externalities, which is called spillovers, that benefit people beyond the specific users of the infrastructure project. In other words, roads, for example, you can charge them tolls that are specific users, but as he explained, around roads and railways, any kind of transport networks, people gain all around at the destinations, on the way, etc., and through connectivity. So even the efficient levy of user charges is not adequate for providing returns to the investor. And that's basic kind of conceptual issue that Professor Yoshino has talked about. Sorry. Yeah. So observing this conceptual issue, Professor Yoshino proposes that the government should pass on at least part of the incremental tax revenue, and you can argue about what percentage of that arrives from the benefits gained by the government through such positive externalities. Now, in some sense, this has been known for a long time in welfare economics, as was applied to project evaluation techniques for appraising investment by actually government and public sector projects. In parenthesis, I should mention that among the pioneers of developing these techniques conceptually was Professor Arnold Harberger earlier from the University of Chicago, lately from UCLA, USC. I'm just mentioning this because he celebrated his 100th birthday on Saturday, actually, the day before yesterday. And I had the privilege of attending the Zoom meeting. Just by the way, this is how some of these techniques were observed. So this was the standard methodology actually used by the Planning Commission all through its existence, by the Project Appraisal Division. So that the point was that when you're appraising public sector or government projects, industrial projects or infrastructure projects, in terms of trying to calculate whether they're beneficial for the government to invest, you have to take account of all these spillovers. And that's exactly what they did in their methodology. And Mr. Nitin Desai, of course, was the Project Appraisal Division advisor for a long time, and before him, Lavraj Kumar. So, but one consequence, this question I want to raise with Professor Yoshino, that one consequence of such thinking is that if the externalities are very large, i.e. the spillovers are very large, for example, through road investment, would it not be a good argument for developing projects through public investment, including user charges, that is tolls, rather than through the private sector? The point being, suppose you have a project for 1,000 crores. Let's say you have a debt equity ratio of 2 to 1. Then the equity investment is say only about 300, 350 crores. The rest of it is borrowed. The borrowing is the same, whether it's the public sector or the private sector. Now, if we're getting the additionality from private investment is say 1/3, that is say 350 crores, then if the private sector then has to be compensated by spillover tax revenues, then they're only investing say half of that. So the additionality I'm just making up the numbers. So additionality would only be 150 crores. If it's even more than that, then what is the justification for getting the private sector involved? Because you're not getting that much money from them. And these are very complex things to do, as Professor Ishino has illustrated. And I might also add, leading to a lot of corruption. So that's an issue I want to just place on the table. This also perhaps explains why almost all expressways in advanced economies have been developed by the government, that is public sector, including the United States. They used to have some private sector toll roads on the East Coast, but they've all been nationalized now. And I don't know in Japan if the expressways are private or public. They're public, right? Yeah, they're all public. And so, in fact, we are in some sense doing a lot of innovation in this. And there's a question that arises whether that's a good idea or not. They also actually, on the land trust, very, very interesting idea, which I think you should, it's very much worth considering because there's so much litigation on land in India. and land acquisition is a real problem. There are also some other interesting examples, where land is concerned, of capturing spillover effects in different countries over time. I remember when I worked on Colombia back in the 1970s and early 80s, one methodology used was called betterment. So there was a levy of betterment taxes which were levied on land values around the roads that were the roads that were developed within a city. Actually, they calculated the increase in land values, and there was betterment levy, and that sort of financed the continuing infrastructure development. Another one, of course, would be familiar to you, Professor Yoshiro, was the land readjustment system used in both Korea and Japan in the urban development financing, I guess till the 80s or something like that. I've not followed it since then. But this involved something similar, the pooling of land of small holders for the purposes of urban land development. And the principal idea was very simple. Landholders were relocated for a temporary period when the land was then redeveloped. After the redevelopment, a portion of the land was returned to them. And that, of course, a much higher value. So they were very happy because got, say, 3 times the value for whatever the land that was taken. And at the same time, the government got land to develop for other uses. So the government got free land to develop. The owners were gained significantly and got the back portion of their land. Such systems have also been used in India, by the way. And I think we call them town planning schemes. Is that right? I think they're called town planning schemes, particularly in Gujarat and Maharashtra. So in some sense, all I'm saying is that what his presentation has given us is a very nice conceptual way of thinking about this. And as he has said, there are many different ways of attacking the same issue and understand the same issue. So, as I mentioned before, India adopted the PPP form of infrastructure financing around the mid-1990s, but have faced many of the problems. Now, much of the debt financing of PPPs was done by public sector commercial banks in the late 2000, after 2008-9 or so, and right through the 2010s. Of course, I mentioned this only happened after I left the Reserve Bank in 2009. And then, of course, the huge NPAs developed in many of these projects. Over the last decade. And this necessitated recapitalization of many public sector banks. And something I've not done yet, but I hope I can do sometime, it's been interesting to calculate how much of the recapitalization of banks was necessitated by NPAs arising from infrastructure PPP projects. And which is sort of, we can think of it that if we use 1,000 crores to recapitalize public sector banks, could we have used that 1,000 crores as equity in doing public sector projects rather than PPP? I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's an interesting exercise. But now the interesting thing is that in principle, the government of India has recognized the spillover benefits that PPP projects give rise to, and so the system of viability gap funding is exactly that. So you're capitalizing the spillover benefits and giving it ex ante to the investor. And maybe the Niti Aayog could do an exercise evaluating the VGF program on this basis, actually, using Professor Yoshino's principles. So the key issue that arises from Professor Yoshino's proposals is to how to calculate the marginal improvement tax revenues to investment in particular infrastructure projects. He's given some examples. Naturally, such calculations have to be done on a ceteris paribus basis, accounting for other reasons for increases in tax revenues. There's obviously, he's given some ideas on how to do this, but I think it's an interesting issue that we need to look into. And furthermore, how much of such increments should be, as he had raised in his own paper, that the Philippines, they gave, look, we can't give all the tax revenues, we give 50%, 30%, or whatever. Those are interesting issues. And then, of course, to also answer the question that if the government transfers these tax spillover benefits to the private investor, what is the eventual additionality you're getting from the private investor for these projects? Is it worth doing all this? So one puzzling issue, and I conclude, that one puzzling issue that arises in India is that after a lot of this infrastructure investment over the last 25 years, the tax GDP ratio has not risen much. In fact, it didn't rise at all from the late 2000s until the last couple of years. Last couple of years, it's gone up somewhat. So I'm puzzled on why there are no more spillover effects of taxes through, and a huge infrastructure program which everyone acknowledges. So that's a puzzle to me. And this is despite the fact that the economy has been growing at around 7% a year, right, for 25%, 6.5, 7, but at a substantive real growth rate. So that's a puzzle to me. So let me conclude by saying that I've learned a lot, and particularly from the lucidity of his presentation, and really presenting complicated ideas in a very simple, easy to absorb fashion. Real lesson, I think, for all of us. So thank you very much. And I hope that the presence of Mr. Sohan Berry here, despite the fact that he's known me for a long time, will mean that Government of India will adopt some of these procedures.
I'm very glad, Rakesh, you didn't require me to tap the table, because we had some unfortunate episodes on Saturday by cutting speakers off. Okay, so we are, because Rakesh was...
So you mean I would have to walk out?
No, well, you may have done. No, so there's 15 minutes for open discussion, but I will take the prerogative of the chair, if you don't mind, to respond now and then open it up. So firstly, just to say 3 or 4 points. One is that to some extent for India, but even for the world, as it were, the relevant moments were Soviet planning in the 30s, and for India in particular, the decision by the Attlee government in 1945 to nationalize the commanding heights of the economy. Okay, and so in some ways, particularly for the UK, but even for ourselves, that you have this period between 45 and Thatcher came in 78, was it? When the notion was that the way in which to, if you like, capture the rents and ensure universal service was through public ownership. And what we have seen is in the 40 years since then, attempts to kind of walk away from that. And let me also say, since I worked with Alan Walters when he was an advisor at the World Bank, I think he'd come after advising Margaret Thatcher. I mean, I think he was very much a kind of an architect and an ideologue for privatization, partly based on the guidance he'd given the government of Hong Kong on a kind of a pure private sector model. The second point is Rakesh's PAD point, because when I was a university student in England, there was a very famous infrastructure paper by David Henderson, who later came to the World Bank and I think may have worked with Alan Walters, on how the UK government, still in the public sector mode, had evaluated the Victoria line, which was a subway line, a metro subway line, that underground line, I should say, constructed, if my memory serves me right, when Rakesh and I were both in England. And so that went through the whole panoply of social cost benefit analysis, but on the assumption not that the government needed to capture this, but there were net social benefits. Okay? And so again, the question of the transition from, as it were, the duty of the government was to establish on the basis of shadow pricing net social benefits, to where we are right now. How do we actually capture those benefits when we try and bring in the private sector? That's the intellectual transition, which I think is still incomplete. And let me also say that the World Bank, and which has provided intellectual leadership, I think sort of lost the plot, because then they started to argue that it's not a technocratic project. It's much more about public participation and decentralization. And now we're in a period where with industrial policy, you believe that, you can create your own comparative advantage. So I think that the clarity of Dr. Yoshino's presentation on really what constitutes quality research in this area is very important. The third point I'd make is that it has been the fate of many projects conceived in PPP, as Rakesh has said, to fail. Why this did not happen with the Shinkansen, or maybe it did, I don't know. But the famous case in the UK was Eurotunnel, because they attempted to create Eurotunnel through entirely private finance. I think also in the Thatcher period, the original investors were dispossessed, but the asset remains. Okay, and so the question of whether it's the asset. And the same happened with highways in Latin America, because the big vogue for privatization was when Rakesh and I were both working on Latin America. So a lot of the traffic forecasts were wrong. A lot of the bondholders got dispossessed, or more importantly, they cashed in the government guarantees. But the assets existed. And so the question is, are you concerned about the asset or concerned about the bondholders? Three final points. One is, I think what is very important from the Japanese experience is to learn that it wasn't fully formed. There's been a lot of learning along the way, and that this is taking place in a densely populated country. That's very important for us. However, I'm not sure we'll get into that. The fact that Japan has, a bit like China, not quite as much, always been blessed with abundant savings, I think is a big difference between Japan and India. Second is, the fundamental question that Rakesh has raised, at the end of the day, what is the problem to which PPPs are the solution? And I would simply say that, in a sense, brought into the discussion when I took over from Rakesh at NCAR, there was a sense that if you like, the efficiency gains from bringing in the private sector outweighed, as it were, the complexities of where we've ended up. But then I think two other things have happened. One is that the Supreme Court has got involved and wants to get into the business of auctioning, and that therefore means the rent is not available to the promoter. I mean, particularly the 2G example, it's all extracted away. Some of us have argued that beauty contests would be better than auctions, but that's now prohibited with public assets. And then there's an issue that I don't think there's a clear doctrine on, which is winner's curse, recontracting. How do you, as it were, finesse that? And so just to say that these are long-term exercises in learning, but that they are particularly important and acute given our aspiration to become a Viksit Bharat and the new challenges. And I just, before opening the discussion, want to salute, as it were, the intellectual contribution of Dr. Yoshino in showing that these issues are capable of rigorous analysis. And Rakesh, since you have a mandate for NITI, let me just say that I hope that you at CSEP, your successor at CSEP will learn these lessons. And now, in the remaining, not too long, let me at least take 3 questions from the floor. To our panelists.
Good afternoon, sir. My name is Akhilesh Srivastav. I am President ITS India Forum, and I, with the Professor Yoshino, I was working on this spillover impact of digital infra in India. The slides which you presented, we drilled for a lot of data, but what you rightly said, sir, when we were comparing the scenario in the Japan and vis-a-vis India, Firstly, a lot of data were not available, and we had to make a lot of assumptions to come to this conclusion. But still, that it shows there is a positive indicator, that 14.2%, with a lot of assumptions which we took on the side that we shouldn't overburden it. So the actual impact is much higher than this. But how we transform into the others? Today we had in Niti Aayog only, sir, the impact of ITS on the transportation sector. That spillover effect will be calculating with them. That's what I just wanted to add.
Okay.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Okay, yeah, please go ahead.
Deepak Maheshwari from CSEP. So, Dr. Yoshino, I mean, I went to Japan first time in '92, Kyoto, and also in Nagoya, etc. Now, one of the important things that Dr. Berry just mentioned, it was in terms of this high density, high rise thing, on which, of course, Professor Dinesh Mohan, Professor Dr. Rakesh Mohan's elder brother, he had done a lot of work even in India on that. Now, what do you suggest in terms of rural infrastructure development, specifically considering that in India, about more than half of the population is still in the rural areas? So what type of models should be looked at from that perspective, considering that the propensity to pay and the ability to pay the user charges there is extremely low because of the lower per capita income in those regions in particular? Thank you.
I think the third question was here.
Thank you, Professor Yoshino, for a very interesting presentation on the macro impact of infrastructure investment. While I appreciate your observation that the spillover effect is low in India, that does not necessarily imply that the spillover effects are not taken into account by the policymakers in the country. Because if you see the DMRC, Delhi Metro Rail Corporation stations, there are few stations which have evolved in the last 5 years dramatically. There is a station at the Connaught Place called Rajiv Chowk. I had not gone there for 2-3 years after COVID. But when I saw that station transformed entirely, so many coffee shops, and there are stations where you find restaurants, bars also, Dwarka Sector 21, Shivaji Stadium shops as a visa processing center with multiple business opportunities. So what I'm saying is that perhaps you may be right in terms of saying that it is not happening at a scale. And the sub-national railways, their stations perhaps not be that sophisticated like the DMRC ones. But of course, at scale it is missing perhaps. My question is that if you think of coastal infrastructure, how do you can also consider tourism as a part of this spillover effect, because if the expressways are linked by artery roads and you plan the coastal cities in such a way that you could attract tourism for, say, ecotourism and other things, which me with few colleagues from Indonesia, we wrote a T20 policy brief on that how the coastal infrastructure could be resilient and economically viable as well. So what is your idea about that? Thank you.
Okay, we'll call it quits now. I'll give Dr. Yoshino the last word. Rakesh, any quick responses, including to what I may have raised? Dr. Yoshino.
Thank you very much for all the very important questions. I think that another difference between Japan and India is high savings rate, domestic savings rate. So we can circulate those money within the country, also within the region. So even rural area, people are saving. So I think that is very important. And savings rate in Japan was very low during samurai period, from 1803 to 1879. Then finance minister at that time, Mr. Maejima Hisoka, he wanted to increase domestic savings. And many people were laughing. Japanese do not have any such kind of custom. So he was very angry, and he started savings for children. He went to the school, and postmasters at that time, they are collecting deposits. So they asked each student to open their own account. And each student started to put $1 every month. And that is the way we created mind of savings. I think that is very important. Even though we are very poor at that time, people started saving domestically. So that will stabilize the financial market. Once you rely too much on foreign investment, then that moves very quickly, comes in, going out. So the share of domestic savings is very important to stabilize it. The rural area in Japan, it is already going on. We are aging society. In rural area, young people are moving to cities, and elderly people are remaining there. So I think we have to think about different way to develop the buildings and apartments. Nowadays, we are attracting so many foreign visitors. They are very interested in old style of Japanese hotels. And they started to open those hotels in rural area. So we have to think about different way. Otherwise, we cannot do the same thing. So that is how we have to develop in rural area. Then I think city planning is also very important. And if you open the station, then many small shops start to opening their places. But that is not coordinated. In case of Japan, the local government, local cities, together with railway company, will plan how to make those regions. And people in the region come into the discussion. Then they think we have created this town, this station. Those kind of mind is very important. If the government will do it, then many people oppose it. So you have to have a community-based meetings and then create the new developed cities. I think that will be very important. And so many good comments and questions. I wish I had 1 more hour to answer all of them. But thank you very much for the great opportunity.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Dr. Berry. I'm very sure last week you have really picked up great art of time management. And I think this has helped all of us today. We are dot on time at 3 o'clock. So thank you. Thanks a lot for this. Big hand for Professor Yoshino for simplicity, for lucidity, and also the substantive gain that we have today in terms of how do we create opportunities. As Yoshino-san, you would recall, starting from Francois and Friedman and Hershaw, we have seen evolution of the idea of growth poles. And in Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, we have tried to think in terms of how growth poles have to come up when we think of cities. Land and land-related issues are a major challenge for India. In this budget, our finance minister has announced digitalization of land records. So you see, the major task that we have to do is yet to be done in terms of how do we identify, as Professor Rakesh Mohan rightly mentioned, lot of litigations that are there and lot of settlements on that. But thanks a lot for your excellent address. I thank Professor Rakesh Mohan for very substantive comments today, and to Vice Chairman Niti for his very elegant chairing. Thank you, and a big hand for them. Please join us for tea now.